live. I know you probably can't see us yet, but if you're watching the replay, thank you so much for attending the Great Value live. I'm really excited to talk about this. Obviously, I've been wanting to talk about it for quite some time, but I don't know. It's an iffy topic. I feel like people can feel pretty strongly one way or another that it's black and white, and there isn't any opinion other than their own that could be right. So, just let my cat out real quick. But so I am excited to talk about it. I did pick people who I think in a lot of ways are not as into dubious consent as I am. So if you're watching and you're like, why is everyone against Heather? It's okay. It's okay if everyone disagrees with me. I am secure and able to, express my opinion about it and not feel like everyone is ganging up on me. So I just want to throw that out. If everyone disagrees with me on every single point, that is okay. It's all right. So I would love for you guys to go around, introduce yourselves, your channel, what you primarily read, but also just a kind of brief yes or no. Do you ever enjoy dubious consent or non-consent in your romances, or are you firmly on the side of just, I don't think it belongs in a romance? Ray, you go first.
All right, I'm Ray. My channel is Bookmark Chronicles. I mostly read, I can now say, fantasy and romance. Thank you, Heather and Nicole. And I do not enjoy it at all. I don't hate it. I'm not going to be like, it shouldn't exist, but like, it's not my favorite because every time I read it, I'm like, oh, I don't like that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nicole. My channel name is Who Picked This Book, and I mostly read romance and cozy mysteries, but I do enjoy a little bit of the dubious consent in my romance. It's the non-consent that kind of gives me the ick feeling, and it's just, based in like, I would never like that, but but yeah, I do like a little sprinkle of dubious consent in my romance. And as long as, we get the whoever's doing the, non-consenting or the dubious consent, like you kind of get their points of view where they're just like they're actually thinking like they're okay and they like this. It's when there's a clear like no and they're not enjoying it is when I kind of have to cross the line.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bethany from Beautifully Bookish Bethany, and I read a lot of things, but I guess mostly sci-fi, fantasy, romance, and horror. Those are probably my most read genres. I don't love it. If I'm reading an older book, I have a little bit of patience sometimes for dubious consent. Like if I'm like, okay, like I'm not necessarily liking it, but like I can deal with it. I have a little more patience for it if it's a book that's a little bit older. I think the newer things are, the less tolerance I have for it. And yeah, I don't like the non-consent thing. I have read one thing that was like consensual acting out non-consent. I've read that a couple times, and like it's not my favorite, but like I'm okay with it. So like I think I think ethically I'm like fine. It's just maybe not like my thing so much. So
like if it's a dom sub game, like there's
yeah,
like a prior
yes,
consenting
like they have,
where like we play this
yes,
game. Right.
like we have a safe word, but we're acting as if like this is a non-consensual situation. Like, okay, not my deal, but like fine.
Right. Because consensual non-consent is just a kink, and it's either your kink or it's not, but it is consensual. It is
Right.
voluntary participation enjoyed by both parties, and it is completely different from dubious consent or especially non-consent, I think. And I know that I do enjoy dubious consent in my romances. And I have a whole discussion video, which I realized after we started, I never did get around to doing the admin for this, so it's not in the description. Nothing's in the description. I haven't done anything, but it will show up there eventually. But so I did, a long discussion video on why growing up in purity culture, I think specifically for me, and I know it is a common thing, although not universal, that growing up being told you can never have sex unless you're married. There's only one type of sex that can possibly be okay. And also Jesus is going to come and you're not even going to live till you're married, but no sexual thoughts. That in my child mind, I was like, loophole, loophole. And that's a really common thing. And even though I have, long before I was sexually active, kind of understood that that was not quite what I was actually seeking. The kind of, I don't know, enjoyment of the flavor, I guess, has remained, even as I've had, great consent in my relationships, even as I'm not confused or not, I've never been like, oh, well, maybe I want someone to violate my consent. That's never been a thing, right? And I think that it is, I guess, important to make the distinction that you can enjoy something fictionally, truly, you can enjoy something fictionally and completely understand and advocate for and be, adamant that that thing's not okay in real life. That, well, they actually did enjoy it. Well, we ended up in a relationship. Well, we love each other now. Doesn't make it okay that they were not really on board and you did it anyways. Like enthusiastic consent, clear consent is important, should always be important. You should never be, and I think that that is something too that people get into where it's like, okay, I like this in my book, so I'm going to make excuses for this behavior. And I'm also going to extend my excuse for this behavior in this book. Well, the hero was traumatized or whatever, so it was okay. That then in real life, well, they have a lot of issues. You can expect something more from them when in reality, you can always expect that other people aren't there for your enjoyment. They're not there for you. You have to respect their boundaries, whether that is they don't even want to talk to you or it's just, hey, I don't want to tonight. Right. So I think that it is important to point out that we are not at all debating whether consent is important, because it is.
In actual life, yeah.
Sure. But, I do think in books, a lot of people enjoy consensual non-consent who maybe wouldn't enjoy it in real life. Or I think that is entirely possible for your real life fantasy maybe to be consensual non-consent, right? You don't want your consent violated. You don't. But you do want that scene acted out in a consensual environment with somebody that you trust that is not going to harm you. And then that kink can easily translate to enjoying a fictional version, or maybe the consent isn't consensual non-consent. Maybe it is dubious consent, but because it's almost like the scene playing out in your story, and you have that love story put in with it a lot of times. And I do want to kind of get into erotica versus romance when it comes to this, but I think that a lot of times, because you might enjoy the idea of the fantasy of consensual non-consent, you might also enjoy fictional dubious consent. And I would be interested to know if you think that maybe you do or don't enjoy dubious consent in your romance at all, because you just don't like it. That's not your thing. It's never going to be your thing, even a little bit. And or you're like, well, maybe it's not my thing. Like no one has to say what they're doing in their bedroom. But maybe it's not my thing. But I can see the appeal. Maybe.
Oh my
I feel like
gosh.
we derailed there real quick.
I feel like yeah, like I think when I first started reading romance, it was like a hard why would anybody ever want to read this sort of thing for me was where I came at it. And I think I've like gotten to the point where I now like can understand that people have very different experiences and different things that they like and don't like, and that's fine. So like,
Right.
yeah. I don't yeah, like I don't like I like very clear consent. I think like the closest um and like my favorite like if I like a lot of times like the things that I like in romance like steamy scenes the most is when there is a lot of communication and there's a lot of like like emotional work going into like what's happening between the couple and that so like that's what I prefer that. I think like the closest to this that like I can enjoy sometimes is um I don't even know what to call it exactly, but something that's like sort of a seduction type thing where it's like not like drawing somebody into maybe being interested in something happening sexually but not taking it beyond like a kid. It's more like the vibe than like actually doing anything. Like I'm going to make you want this and tell me you want this kind of thing. Like that I like, but I don't anything kind of beyond that. It's just not really my
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it also has to do with Bethany, you touched a little bit on this, like older books. Like I've been reading romance for, the better part of 20 years. So it's like the books that I'm reading, like that just come out, like are new, 2010 plus kind of thing, versus what I read when I was just starting out reading romance, like stuff that I found on my mom's, bookshelf, and I recently, like, I want to say within the last couple of years, I reread like one of my first romance books and I was reading it and I was like, really? Like,
that happened to me 2 days ago. I was like, oh, I hate this. I hate everything about this.
When I first read it, loved it. Like, oh my God, I've never read
Right.
anything like this. This is so great. And then like the more you read of the genre, sorry, my son is actually right here. But the more I read of the genre and the more books you read and they kind of read different things, you're kind of like, oh, this like what I used to read is kind of like on the edge,
Right.
And it wasn't even considered like, racy romance back then. It was just like that's just how men treated women, actually. So it's unfortunate.
We've come a long way in how we talk about this. So
yeah,
for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it also has to do with I'm kind of with Bethany with you as well. Like if I'm reading like an 80s romance or like an 90s romance, I'm like, okay, that's kind of the time. It's kind of like, yes, it's not okay, but I could deal with it. Like nowadays, if it's not like, especially like trigger warnings are important. Like if the author doesn't list the trigger warnings, like, hey, this book has dubious consent or non-consent, and you're not prepared for it, you could be like, this really should have been at the front. Like this is what you could expect to read this. So that's when I really think like trigger warnings are super important as well.
Yeah.
I think for me, I remember like the first time I ever remember reading it was Desperate Measures by Katie Robert. And so there was a content warning and I was like, okay, I don't know how I'm going to feel about this, but I'm going to keep going. And then like we get to the scene and I was like, I don't think I like this. And then they finally have the conversation later and she's like, I wanted you to catch me. And I was like, okay, I wish I had known that then though. That would have made this a little easier for me to get through because I was like, what is happening?
Right.
What is happening?
See, I knew before I read it. And so I was like, oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, like in hindsight, I was like, oh, all right, I get it. But while I was reading it, I was like, what the fuck is going on?
Right. Yeah. And that's one of those books where I think especially if you're reading it knowing it's consensual non-consent, you can be like, oh, that one little sentence there where it was like, we exchanged the look. was
enough for me.
Like, very easily missed, honestly. And again, like it kind of depends on whether you would like that anyways, like as a kink, as a scene in the book, or if you were like, no, like no, you needed to do a whole spell out. And sometimes I read this one book one time where it was she was like a captive in the basement, like she got kidnapped and put in the basement and stuff was happening, and I'm just like reading and stuff, and then you get to the end of the book and they were married, and it was a scene that they did. I was like,
no,
what is happening right
You're like, what is this plot twist? They're
Listen,
already married, and it was a whole thing.
I kept like flipping. I was in the ebook, but I kept flipping pages, being like, did I like get into like a preview of another book? Like, what is it? I was so confused. I was just going back and forth because he fell asleep or something and left the door open, and she escaped, and instead she was cooking him breakfast when he come up, and I was like, what is going on?
You're like, wow, this Stockholm syndrome really just took hold real fast.
Like I read it years ago, and I have not stopped being shocked by it, because I was just like, what do you mean the whole thing I just read was a lie? Like, so like I can understand with Desperate Measures being like, what do you mean? But I don't know what else I was gonna say about that, but yeah.
I was gonna bring up Desperate Measures as something like, in that kind of context, like something I can handle, but when it's a clear, like no and not enjoying, and that's why a lot of times, like, I don't know, like I don't really enjoy like stalker romances or like the serial killer romances when it's directed, I guess, at another one of the main characters. I really don't enjoy that.
Yeah, me either.
I know for me, one, I think if you're having a lack of consent, like you guys said, it was much more prevalent back in the day in romance genre. And I do want to talk about, are we phasing out of that as we as a society talk more about consent? Are we phasing out of it in romances as well? But I think nowadays, if you have a lack of consent, for me, it automatically goes into the dark romance genre. Whether the rest of the book is particularly dark or not, I don't think that you can have a lack of consent and call it contemporary and call it, but like for me, it automatically shoehorns into dark romance. And the dubious consent is the dark content. And I think for me, it's one of those things where this book I like, this book I don't. You might look at them and say they're almost like exactly the same dynamics or scenes or whatever, but for whatever reason, this author for me hit it in a way where I was like, okay, I don't hate absolutely everything about this. And then this author did the same type of scene, the same type of relationship, the same type of dynamic, and they just I don't know, it just rubbed me the wrong way, and I never was able to like really like them together, because it was like shouldn't really be there. But I think that some of it is, again, with the communication and the saying no and things like that, it's not necessarily the level of enjoyment, because I want to be cautious against being like, if they enjoyed it, then it's okay, right? Because in a romance book, almost always they're going to end up enjoying it. Not every time. I've read some where they did not, and again, it was just like, oh. But I think it's when the main character is trying to communicate and the hero is just completely ignoring everything. They're just ignoring them, and they're doing everything anyways, even if it's not sexual, even if it's just, I don't know, taking them to another location or a date, or making them talk to, I don't know, whatever it is. If the main character is trying to communicate and the person that's supposed to love them is just completely ignoring all of their attempts, I'm not gonna like that. That's always gonna be a thing where, okay,
I
I
guess
don't like it.
the thing that bothers me, especially in things that have been published more recently, when it's like, oh, but they're enjoying it kind of thing, is that it, like I've read some of the research on sexual assault, and like people can have physical pleasurable responses to sexual assault, but it's still traumatic and it's still sexual assault, even if their body is having some kind of a biological response.
Absolutely.
And so I think like part of why that kind of thing really bothers me is because I think it feeds into some of this myth that like, oh, well, like if you liked it or if this happened, it's not really assault. And especially when it's happening with men, because there's this idea. Anyway, I don't know. So I think that's the thing is like, I think too much about those things. I can't like get out of my head about that when I'm reading it. It's like it's one thing if I'm reading something, I'm like, okay, it came out 20 years ago, whatever, like I can deal with it. But for things written now, that it bothers me and it makes me question the author, honestly. Like, unless you're specifically being like, this is what the book is, it's a content warning, this is supposed to be more of a kink thing, and like this is who the audience is for, then that's one thing. But if like somebody's just like putting that there for and they think it's okay, I'm like,
yeah,
I don't know.
No, it makes sense. Context is important. Yeah. Ray and Nicole, do you have anything to say before I talk over you?
I was actually going to bring something up like that, Bethany. You said like your body can have a physical response to like traumatic, experiences, and it doesn't mean that your consent is finally given because you enjoyed it. You still said no, and it's important to make that distinction.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with both Nicole and Bethany. Because someone recommended that I read Den of freaking Vipers, and I was like, no, this is a hard no, and why the hell did you tell me to read this? And I knew that I was not going to like it. I was like, I feel really weird that this person recommended this to me, so I'm going to read it to see how this works out. And I was like, yeah, no, this is not something that you can recommend to someone that you don't know without any sort of warning and like not have a conversation about that. And I was like, why the hell? And I was like, all right, well, this is part of one of my many issues with book talk, because that's where that happened. But
it was big on book talk.
Yeah, 100. That was floating around a lot.
Yeah,
I know just enough about it to know that I'm not reading it.
You would not like it.
Surprisingly enough, I did enjoy that book, but
but
I was like, when you were talking about it, I was just like, did I recommend that book to Ray? No, I don't think
But you had recommended that to me, we would not be friends anymore.
I mean, I know a lot of people have had Den of Vipers be their introduction to dark romance and stuff, but to me, I'm just like that's not the starting point.
I don't feel like that's a good.
I haven't read it. I have no interest in reading it.
Not a good starting point at all.
Right.
That or Haunting Adeline. Like a lot of people like that recommendation from book talk and just ran with it.
I think I have an issue too with people just like thinking it's okay to throw the dark romance newbies in the deep end, and I'm like, no.
Oh God.
Yeah, Haunting Adeline is a lot of horrific stuff. Truly, it is. Mm-hmm. And again, I haven't read it. I know I don't want to. I know a lot about it without having read it. And I don't know. I think a lot of times it's the recommendations specifically are done on shock factor.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's taking care of people in a lot of ways. I think that's a problem. I know we were talking earlier, and Haunting Adeline plays into it, about like stalker romances and things like that. I know for me, when it comes to dubious consent and or stalker and or whatever, the more realistic it is, the less I enjoy it. If that makes sense. If it's your ex-boyfriend, if it's the fan, when it's things that happen to people constantly, I don't like that setup as much. When it's a professor taking advantage of a student, like, I don't enjoy that. You give me an alien or a Highlander or a warlord, I'm much more able to enjoy it because that's not actively happening to people down the street from me, even if I think you could argue a lot about, certain dynamics or things currently happening. Again, it needs to be dark romance, it needs to be fantasy romance, it needs to be sci-fi, it needs to be something where it's like, we're not saying that your partner, what your partner is doing to you is okay. That's and it's not so close to the reality that they're like this, and you have to watch people on TikTok be like, oh, I love that man. Like, book boyfriend. Well, he's actively doing the same thing as your abuser.
Literally.
Like,
I am always concerned, and I don't know that this is necessarily the case, but sometimes I get concerned that like there are some people who read this stuff and like haven't reckoned with dubious consent that's happened in their own lives and like haven't acknowledged that that's what it is, and like read things like this because it like lets them gloss over that.
yeah.
So that makes sense. And I don't know that this is true of everybody. Like I also think there are other reasons that people might, like I know there are also people who find like CNC healing from trauma, for instance, like as a kink thing.
Right.
So like that's fine. I get that. But I've seen comments on Book Talk and like different things that make me feel like, I don't think you really realize that this isn't consent and that this is sexual assault, and that maybe if that did happen to you, you haven't like, because you're scared of what that would mean about the person in your life who did that, like you don't want to reckon with that, you know?
Well, I think more than one thing can be true at the same time. It can be okay to enjoy romance, dubious consent and stuff, no matter where you are on your healing journey, right? And also, it would be good for you to be able to recognize consent and to understand that your consent has been violated, because I think that's true for far more people than it's not true for, right?
Yeah.
Of any gender, by any perpetrator. Like there's a lot going on there, right? Where many, I would say the majority of people have had their consent violated. Maybe they consented to the date, maybe they were in an established relationship, what have you. A lot of people have had their consent violated without recognizing it, because it is more accepted, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, but you're right. And also I think sometimes with the comments, you have people who are stating that they are a survivor and saying, hey, I don't like this. And then you have other people who are also stating that they are a survivor. And I am not, drawing that into question or anything. Also saying that they are a survivor, being so awful to the person who said that they don't like it because of their own experience. And it's like, I can't imagine in a time where I care so much about being able to read this book that I have to attack you and I have to actively try and harm you online, right? Because you said, hey, this reminds me of my trauma. I don't like it.
Well, because we cope with things in different ways and we heal in different ways. And like, you can't, expect that like everybody who's been through something is going to respond to it the same way.
Right.
This is the thing that I've thought about, like that I've come to terms with the older I've gotten. And I don't know how many of Heather, I know you grew up with like heavy religious background. I don't know if either of you. Okay.
I don't know about Ray. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because one thing that like, I feel like later on I finally figured out that is, I think, a consent issue that's not talked about a lot, is like in church, the way I grew up, right, there was this idea that like, okay, if you're married, your body doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your spouse, kind of thing.
Right.
And so there's a lot of pressure that like, well, if you're married, you should be like sexually available, and so then even if you're with a partner who wouldn't violate consent in that way, you might sort of like put yourself in a situation where you don't necessarily want to do something, but you feel like you need to because like Jesus. And like that, like that. Yeah. And so I think that's something that isn't always talked about that can be really harmful in the long run as well.
Yeah. I agree.
The argument where it's just like, well, it's not sexual assault if you're married, if it's your spouse, like it's super harmful.
Yeah.
Well, and even like something that's not necessarily to the point of sexual assault, where like you are giving verbal consent and you are like, you know, whatever, but in your brain you're like, I don't really want to be doing this, but I feel like
you're doing it because it's your wifely duty,
right,
or your husbandly duty,
right.
And Jesus said in the Bible,
and your spouse may not even realize that
other.
like that's what's going on, you know.
And also that verse is very much used for, if you don't give your partner sex, then you can't be surprised when they cheat on you. And I think part of that, I'm so serious about this. I think part of that is that in religious situations, masturbation and porn and all of that either doesn't exist or it's wrong. There's no option other than having sex with your spouse to have any sort of relief.
Right.
You know, so it's just like a lot of very healthy, very normal sexual things are so taboo in the church that it creates a lot of problems that just don't need to exist.
That's true.
But yeah, all right, bring it back.
I'm like, Heather, let me just like jump all over those things.
Completely correct. All of that is correct.
Heather said, let's reel this back in.
Let me go to the chat for a second because I've been completely ignoring them and I feel bad about it. So Roger doesn't like it at all, and I agree. Power dynamics are a big issue, and consensual non-consent is different. Although I can easily see either you like both or you don't like both, right?
Yeah. Oh, you know what has CNC in it, actually? I don't know that I said this in my review, maybe I should have, but A Power Unbound by Freya Marsk. It's like the last book in this like historical fantasy, queer fantasy romance mystery series. A Marvelous Light was the first one. Anyway, the third one just came out, and it's got like some power play dynamics and CNC.
Are they standalone companions, or is it like one couple?
It's one couple per book, but there's an overarching plot that you would spoil yourself on if you didn't read them in order. So it's like a gay romance, a sapphic romance, another gay romance.
You said Power Unbound was that one?
Yeah.
Okay. I searched the first title and I was not getting the right book, so I was like, that's not it. All right. So yeah, I think a lot of people are ashamed because I think they really feel like they're saying it's okay to rape somebody if they like dubious consent in their book, and it's not. It's not the same thing. They can absolutely be mutually exclusive, and you don't have to feel bad about enjoying a fictional scene like you would somehow enjoy watching somebody be assaulted. That's just, it's not true. It's not it. It's not like, it's just not what that means. Yes, those old Highlander and historical romance books, they have no consent a lot of times.
I remember, I think I read like the first like Kathleen E. Woodywis book, and I got like 8 pages in, and I'm like, no. I think that was like the fastest DNF like I've ever done. I'm like, nope, not doing it. Like, he's like this like ship captain or whatever, and mistakes her for, you know, a lady of the night, and just like takes her into his ship, proceeds to, you know, and she's like, it was bad. And I was like, they're the main couple. They're the couple. They're it. And I'm like, how are you gonna explain this and make them fall in love and be a couple after this? Like, I cannot. And like the fact that he said like so many times, like, oh, you'll like it, like you'll learn to like it. Like, done.
Right.
That used to be a thing though. Like, you'll learn to like it. You just are too pure and innocent. You just don't know.
Right. In a lot of cases, that was true. They didn't know how to enjoy sex in a lot of ways, but in the same case, doesn't mean you ignore that they don't want to do it right now.
Right. It was just like bikes all around.
So this one says I'm ace, but I do read romance and Dubcon and CN, but I don't like it if it has an HEA with the offender, which brings me to do you think that there is a difference between erotica and romance when it comes to consent and darker kinks, I guess? Well, I'll kind of put that in quotation marks because it's the kink of the author or the reader, right? But it's not a scene or anything on page. It's the real events. Do you think that that's different? And I actually got this comment on my discussion video from an author about how you can have non-consensual erotica and it is just the sex, right? Because the difference between erotica and romance is erotica is about the sex and romance is about the relationship, right?
Yeah.
In romance, you're going to end in the relationship. Erotica, you could have never seen each other before, never going to see each other again. It's just that scene. Do you think that it is different?
I do.
Yep, absolutely. If yeah, we all know that romances, they end in an HEA, are happy for now, and if it doesn't, it's not a romance, I think.
Right.
And so, but yeah, there is that difference between and I guess it's at the point where like some readers like don't know that that's a difference. They think that if there's sex in a book, then it's a romance, and it's not always the case.
Yeah, for sure.
I think, yeah, erotica I feel like can be really different because a lot of times you don't have, like, not always, but like in a lot of cases you don't even have super developed characters. I mean,
Right.
sometimes it varies, I guess, but like sometimes it's like it more exists, I feel like, for the sex and as almost like a like self-insert or sort of like titillating scene type thing. I just feel like it's very different as opposed to something where you're expected to like care about the characters and root for them to be together at the end. That to me is like two very different functions of a story.
Right. Yeah. So that brings me to do you all feel like, and I think that this can expand beyond dubious consent and non-consent, but certainly includes it. Do you feel like romance, if you have it in your romance book, you are almost condoning it, not necessarily in real life, right? But you're saying that these characters, it's okay that they did this because they're together, and or again, does it really vary by subgenre? Because for me, it does vary by subgenre, and I think that a lot of, like we were talking about, historical romances, I think a lot of things with historical and contemporary, you're seeing the difference in the way that people are talking about things because of the difference in society and the way that we expect to be talked to about these things. And I think that a lot of people want to argue that romance is inherently feminist or is, anti-patriarchy because women enjoying things.
Not necessarily.
And you've got a lot of very interesting things included in your book. So I don't know. How much of it do you think is condoning it if it's in a romance, or encouraging it maybe, or excusing it even?
Ray, I feel like you should talk because we've been talking.
I think it depends on like, obviously context is important. And at the end of the day, I feel like for me personally, I'm never going to root for a couple where one of them has been violated or the consent has been violated or one of them has abused the other in any way, shape, or form. And I feel like I don't know if an author's intent would be to condone it, but I could definitely see how it might be read that way. But also I know for like, I wouldn't ever make it to the end of a book where that happens to see like what plays out or if it's addressed or how it's addressed. I don't know. I don't know. Come back to me.
I'm at that part where it's like, I'm not here to yuck somebody's yum kind of thing. Like, so I know, like, if you read a certain book and you enjoy it, and if I read that same book and I don't enjoy it, I'm not, you know, kind of looking at you sideways kind of thing. And I'm not thinking that you know, condone it in real life or anything like that. It's just certain people, like, you know, Heather, you were saying at the beginning, there are certain things you like in your fiction that you know is not okay in real life. And there is that line that you can see clearly, you know. And I don't think a certain way just because you would enjoy that that in a book as opposed to I don't. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't like seeing it in newly published books that are traditionally being published. I don't, to me, like, there is a difference too between like what people get away with when they're indie or self-published, versus if a traditional publisher is picking up a book or putting something out. If it's not an older book, I don't want to see that there. Because I guess because I feel like people who get into indie romance, like, at least kind of maybe know what they're getting into. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like at least for me, like, my expectations are different of what I might encounter if I'm picking up something that hasn't been traditionally published. And so I feel like what people can get away with is a little bit different. And I do wonder sometimes, because so many of these like indie pub books are getting picked up now by traditional publications. I don't know what they're doing about that. Like, I do know some things have been fixed. Like, I know there in Ice Planet Barbarians, there was a scene that was changed for traditional publication, but with some of the other stuff, I don't know what they're doing about it because I haven't read a lot of them. But that's a question I have.
Yeah. And speaking of Ice Planet Barbarians, I feel like that's a pretty good example of where I can like dubious consent and not necessarily feel a type of way against the hero, because in Ice Planet Barbarians you have a purple alien who is like my mate, and he would not have been like that to just any unprotected female species.
Well, it's like there's different cultural expectations that they're coming in with, and they don't know.
So for him, he was like, this is my mate. Of course she's going to love this. This is what she wants. We can't speak to each other. We don't have the same language, but this is how mates are. There's never not been in my lived experience. So of course. And the main character, again, was not like particularly upset or traumatized or anything by the hero, but at the same time she was like, what are you doing? What are you doing? I just met you. And so that's one of those where I can read that and I can enjoy it, and I cannot think badly of either party because they weren't trying to harm each other. And I think sometimes intent does matter. Like, do you just not care whether they want it or not? Do you just not care how someone else feels? Especially, again, like the person that you're supposed to love and spend the rest of the book and the rest of your life with. You don't care that, and it doesn't have to be sexual. It can be going to a party. You don't care that they don't want to go. You don't care because you want to. Sometimes that will offend me more than this alien is just trying to take care of his mate. Like, he's trying to be nice.
That's also kind of like, that's interesting that you bring up Ice Planet Barbarians, because yes, there is, you know, that scene was taken out with Bethany. Yes, you're in the first book. Yeah. And I was thinking, like, when you were speaking, I was just like, I guess those books could be considered kind of like a dubious consent, but I really didn't even think that they were, because it's a fated mates situation. So I was just like, yeah, they're mates and they're resonating. Like, they gotta be together.
See, this
But
is why I have questions about the fated mates thing sometimes, because to me that is dubious consent. Like, and I don't. Sometimes I can be on board with it, and sometimes I'm like, I don't know.
Because I love a good fated mates.
Right.
I really, and of course, everyone who knows me, who have been anywhere near my channel for any length of time, knows that I really enjoy Ice Planet Barbarians. But it's like that's super interesting, and it kind of goes back to what Heather was saying, that if there's like a fantasy or a paranormal or alien element, where I kind of not necessarily excuse it more, but excuse it more because it's it's not real,
Right.
and it's when it's more contemporary, like it's like
when it's a
Haunting
frat
Adeline.
I think it's a lot more like
that's when I'm just like, whoa, this is too much like real life. But when it's a blue alien or a werewolf shifter, I'm just like, yeah, that's not real. I'm for it.
Right. Exactly. And also at the same time, I can be like, okay, well, I'm not going to recommend this to Ray or Bethany. I know they wouldn't like it. Like,
now that you mention it, I'm Robin to read Ice Planet with me next month, so I'll report back.
Yes, please.
It's only been 2 years coming.
Literally.
I mean, I read Ice Planet and it was fine. Like, I didn't like the second book though. I DNF'd the second book, and I haven't continued with the series. So
yeah,
I can't remember now what it was.
I know for me, Ice Planet was one of those things where I was like, I am not into aliens. That's weird. That's weird. That doesn't do anything for me.
See, like, I can like the alien thing. I like her. What's her other series?
Her other alien series?
Her other alien series.
She has Ice Home or Corsairs or
no. It's like the
Rizdiverse?
Rizdiverse,
yeah.
I like the Rizdiverse books.
Yeah.
Because they're like a marriage of convenience setup usually, which I really like that. And like we're married and now we're kind of getting into each other, like that I enjoy. So I don't mind the alien thing. I can do aliens. I think it's like the specific.
Also in those books, because it is by the same author, also in those books, they now have translators and things where they speak the same language.
Yes.
So it's another, and also they know of each other's existence. They've heard of
so that I like. I don't really like the you're a strange species, we can't communicate. It doesn't really do anything for me.
What author that I really like that often writes, not often, I shouldn't say often, that writes dubious consent. In some of her books she writes dubious consent, and in some of her books it's more like taboo relationships, and it's Claire Kent. She writes, it is actually the pen name of a traditional author, and this is where she writes like her more out there, steamy, shorter indie books, right? And her sci-fi ones, a couple of them have dubious consent. One of them is a caveman romance. Well, I don't even know that one's really dubious consent. It kind of is, I guess, because you're in her head and you're in his head. But for him, he wants her to be his mate, and she has to. They have this whole culture. She has to go after him. He can't go after her because that is the way their consent works. The women have to pick the man, and then you can try and woo them basically if they have already been like, okay, I'm interested in you. And she is, they have a language barrier, and that doesn't mean that he violates consent. Now she is, there is like another person, like a teenage boy who had also been dumped on this planet years before, so he speaks both languages, so he's kind of explaining a little bit to her like what's going on and stuff. But so she's like, okay, well, I'm tired of sleeping in the cold on the rock on the edge of the society. He has like this nice nest. Maybe it would be worth hooking up. I don't know, and she is also like actively planning on leaving when she can get a spaceship, and he's like, we're made for life. We're gonna love each other forever. And of course, eventually they have a happily ever after. But she writes things like that where it could easily go left in a lot of ways. And she's like, okay, but we're not going to. We're going to kind of play with it a little bit, but not in crossing these lines that I have set for myself and my characters and my readers and stuff. And then also with her taboo books, she writes it in a dystopian setting. So it's like, okay, yes, you're 15 years older than me, but we were just still in our little town and you were the mechanic and I was, working at the grocery store, we would have never had a romance. You would have never pursued me. You feel very conflicted about the age gap, even though the world has literally ended and we spend all of our time together through forced proximity and you're like keeping me alive and you think I'm the best thing that's ever happened in the entire world, but you can't get over the fact that I'm younger than you. And so, like, what's wrong with you that you would even consider it? So she writes things like that and she like explores them on page with the characters, where the characters often are conflicted because they want to be in a relationship with this person. And a lot of times the person with more power in the dynamic, if you want to say, one worships the ground, the other one walks on and wouldn't hurt them for anything in the world. And she was just like, I can't do this. This is wrong. And you have to like spend a lot of the book convincing them that it's okay to be in a consensual relationship with an adult that's younger than them. Right. So I don't know where I was going with that either. But you should read those books if it sounds good. It's really
But
good.
it's going like, because you said that author was traditionally published and also they do more of their darker, more taboo stuff.
Yeah.
Indie. So it's like you do get away with a lot more stuff when you're independently published.
Right.
And that's an interesting conversation. And I feel like that could be a whole conversation in and of itself,
Right.
what what you can get away with in indie published romances versus traditional.
Well, because you're all the liability is on you. There's not a publisher taking a chance on a lawsuit
Right.
or like,
Exactly.
like getting
it's all about that, like what's happening. When like traditional publishers, they look at what's happening in the world and they might think like, oh, that's not going to sell, or that's a little too risky, kind of thing. And they wouldn't really allow that. But yeah, you can definitely get away with a lot more stuff when you're
it's not just that like you're taking the risk, you're niching down. So you're not going to everyone that just randomly picks up a romance book in a bookstore. You're like going down to the people that specifically like this trope, this subgenre, this, whatever. And they're not just going to accidentally read your book. They're just not.
Yeah.
They want to reach as many readers as possible because of the monies, right?
Right.
It has to be generalized.
Well, which is why like the indie books getting picked up are the ones that have become these huge bestsellers and gone viral. So it's worth the risk. Yeah, it's interesting.
For sure. I would be curious to know what you all think about the layers of dynamics. So I know, like, for me, I don't like, if this is maybe controversial, but for me, if it's a dark romance and there are already iffy dynamics, I don't also want it to be an age gap. I don't also want it to be an interracial romance where the main character is not white and then the male perpetrator hero is white. I don't also want it to be a boss and an employee. Like if you're going to go, and I know some of that is taboo, which is not really my genre. I don't really enjoy taboo romance. But if you're going to go dark, I think that other parts of your book have to not be, things that are problems across the board in society, and you just ignore that. You made your main character Black and you never once talked about race, and you also have this white man like doing very questionable things. That always icks me out. Whereas, one, if it was a healthy relationship, great. And or if there wasn't like that extra layer of power imbalance, I would be more okay with the relationship dynamics that we are having. Nothing.
Well, also going back to authors putting stuff out there for shock value, putting quote unquote too much or those extra layers of, as the dynamic as you're saying, they're kind of like, how far can I push this envelope and when is it too far, kind of thing. Where if I read something and I'm just like, it gets to be too much, like where it's just like, it's like, I feel like if it's a dark romance, just one element of dark is fine,
Right.
but just like, you don't like stalker romance. Great. It's a stalker romance. Fine. But it's just like, okay, it's a stalker. And, you also have, other kind of things in there and they just keep kind of like adding tropes or adding things in there. And I'm just like, I'm like Fat Amy and Pitch Perfect. I'm like, enough, kind of thing. Like where it's like, you don't need to keep pushing the envelope for it to be, dark, just one element of a dark thing and it's dark. You got it. Congratulations. Right.
Yeah, I agree with that because I also am not a fan of like taboo situations in general, especially like things where there might be an age gap or like a professor and student, and like those things just immediately give me the ick. And then like I don't like the power dynamics. I don't like or like when one of the characters is like having their choices taken away or whatever the case, like those things just make me not enjoy the book in general. And then if you think that adding more things to that and making it more complicated is like that's not fun for anybody. Like there's like, people can enjoy what they enjoy and dip into darker elements, but then if you're just like stacking things on top of each other just for fun, it's like, okay, calm down.
Right.
I guess like there's kind of two pieces to this for me, which is like number one, for me it matters a lot who's writing the book. Because like if a white author is throwing in racial dynamics, probably with that other stuff, probably not. No.
Right.
I do think there are some Black authors who might do some of that, but more intentionally because they're like exploring a larger theme and it might be dark and intense and it might be a lot. Like I think, like I know I haven't read all of them, but I know even like Kennedy Ryan has done some things that like exploring like abuse stuff. I don't know. So like that I'm more okay with. Like there are people that I would trust to like do a reasonably good job and where it's intentional and they know what they're trying to do and like how they're trying to explore it. But like if it's an author who's throwing it in because like, oh, this will make it even more shocking, absolutely not. So I think the other thing though too though is with taboo stuff, I don't know. I can like taboo stuff sometimes. I think if it's done thoughtfully, I think there are ways to like get a bit of a taboo situation that isn't that bad. So like, if you want to play with the like sort of teacher student dynamic, for instance, having like say like a professor and an older grad student in their 30s in someone else's class, like something like that, where it's like they have like it's kind of playing with that, but like you've done enough so that the power imbalance isn't so dramatic, and I can like stuff like that. So I have seen,
yeah, I definitely agree. One on the author, which I have read dark interracial romance by Black authors that I liked and didn't like, right? Or I thought, or maybe I even liked it, but I was like, but you never said anything about this. And also, you can not it. lots of people like things that go far beyond my comfort lines. That's just a fact, right? A lot of dark romance, a lot of taboo romance goes far beyond my comfort lines. And that doesn't make those people wrong and me right. And my line is okay. And if you like what I like, then, you know, we're good. And if you go too far or not enough, then, well, then you're a prude or whatever. Like, that's just not true. But I definitely feel like, again, one element. If you're going to have dubious consent, don't also have age gap. If you're going to have dubious consent and age gap, don't also have it be professor student. If you're going to have dubious consent and age gap and professor student, don't also have the main character be 18 today. You know, like,
unless it's erotica, and that's what you're doing,
right?
Like, I guess.
And that's what you're doing, and that's totally fine. But I am probably not going to enjoy it, just to be honest. And yeah, content warnings make a huge difference to me. They really, really do, because don't even get me started on the content warnings that are like, some of you are sensitive and you shouldn't read it. And I'm like, that is not a content warning.
No.
Works that way.
No, thank you.
But, you know, there's nothing wrong with this. This book has dubious consent on page between the hero and the main character. Thank you. Great. Thanks. Now I know whether I want to read or not.
Or those authors that say, oh, like content warnings or trigger warnings are spoilers, and it's like, no, like some people want to know. Like,
no.
Some people want to know exactly what they're getting into, you know, and just like give them what they want, because you don't want them to read your book and then get surprised and not like it and give you a bad review. So,
right.
Yep.
Yeah. You guys have anything else to add?
I don't know. Sometimes there's books that I think I'm like, you know, if you had changed this thing, I would have been okay with this.
Yeah.
Like, I know this is a popular book that a lot of people really are into, but I for a project once read Birthday Girl by Penelope Douglas.
Oh yeah, a lot of people love that. You didn't like it?
No.
Okay.
I have a spoilery reading vlog if you want to see why. I didn't like it. But, no, but like one of the big things I said is I was like, listen, like this power dynamic situation, even if you had made it like, you know, if you want it to be taboo, like maybe because the whole thing is she ends up with her boyfriend's dad and she's like just barely 18. But I'm like, and the boyfriend is, you know, crappy, but okay. Anyway, but I'm like, if you wanted to do this, maybe have it be like his older cousin who's in his late 20s. Like you get a little bit of an age gap. It's still taboo, but it's not like so dramatically imbalanced in terms of the power. And it's an HEA, and I was like, oh no.
You know what's funny with that is I can think of a couple of Black romance Thanksgiving novellas right now where the whole thing is they get with like another relative.
Yep, I was thinking the same thing.
But the thing is too, is not like against their ex-boyfriend, or it's not. I can't get into the boyfriend's dad thing where the boyfriend or the fiance or whatever is trash. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but a man who has no relationship with his child and is a bad parent is not attractive. Like, I hate it. I'm just like,
it's like you raise that kid, so
great.
Again, like Erotica had one of these. She had a dystopian one where like he didn't know that his kid existed for half of the kid's life, and then the mother actively like didn't want him involved. And then you know, it's dystopian, there's lung disease and all of this stuff because of the air quality. And the dad like comes in to rescue the boyfriend and the mom, but the mom has already passed. The boyfriend is dying from the lung stuff and has his girlfriend and is like, I'm only coming with you if she can come too. And he's like, yeah, like, let's go. Let's not die. Let's go. And then it's like years and years and years and years later that they start a relationship. And he wasn't a bad dad. The boyfriend was not a bad person. And again, you have like all these dystopian layers that just are not true in our world, where like you have lots of other options, you know. But Birthday Girl, I'm just like, what do you mean you're fighting with your son about how he's treating his girlfriend? And like,
the other thing too is he goes, okay, listen, I was just like, the double standard is a lot, because she's like swimming in the pool in her bikini, and he's like being a creep looking at her, and then notices his next door neighbor doing the same thing and gets mad and fights with him about it. I'm like, dude, please. Only I can look at my son's girlfriend like that.
Well, now I want to read it just for the drama.
Oh. And he's so immature. Get over it.
Honestly, I did enjoy Birthday Girl. But did anybody also read Your Dad Will Do by Katie Robert?
Yeah.
I didn't read that one.
Did I DNF that one?
I think so.
I think you did, I wouldn't be surprised if you did.
Yeah.
I liked that book more, but
I liked that book more too. Also, that book was a lot more the sex rather than the relationship.
Yeah. I was listening to it on Scribd, and I think it skipped. So like they're doing like something else is happening, and then she's having a conversation with the ex-boyfriend, and I was like, wait a minute, what
just happened?
I was like, oh, I missed something. Oh well.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's fine.
I think this is true. There's this comment from Lauren Garcia about not understanding power dynamics when you're young. I think this is really true. I do think when you're like a teenager, you think you're more mature than you are. But that's also part of why I don't like books like Birthday Girl, because it romanticizes this stuff that really does happen. And I don't know.
Right. Yes, very much so. And like, I get that maybe that your book is adult, you know, and what would be okay in adult romance is not what you're marketing as YA, but your character's still 17, 18, 19. So to be like, well, teenagers, this isn't for you, it's a stretch in my opinion. Like,
I mean, I had friends as a teenager who were like hooking up with much older men.
Right.
Like that's a thing. It's like, this is a thing that really
a very common thing. Yeah.
A very common thing. And like their whole life, like the stuff he says to her, I'm like, those are grooming lines. Like, you're so mature for your age.
Right.
Oh God, no.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I completely agree. Yes, I think that this is very true. I think that's very true. And I also think a lot of times, again, for me, a lot of times it works a lot better if the power dynamic things are not things that the hero is actively setting in place, or I don't know, he's not really involved in it. I'm much more okay if it is, I don't know, he's the king of the fantasy land, whether you're like, he's not going to stop being the king. He is the king, and obviously there's a power dynamic, or it's the head of the alien horde, or whatever it is. You know, like I'm much more, and you're his destined bride. I'm much more okay with all of that than I am with, I don't know, the creepy neighbor.
But also to that point, like, yes, if you're actually grappling with the power dynamic, that can make it work. But just naming the power dynamic is not the same thing as grappling it, like with it. Like, just because you named on the page that this problematic thing is happening doesn't mean you've dealt with it.
Right.
Because I've read a few things where I'm like, I think you think this makes it okay. It doesn't.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's like, I want to see you wrestle with it. I want to see the self-loathing.
Or like find a solution, figure out a way to make it work, because you can, you know, but yeah. And it just brings it back to, it's not, this is always great or this is always terrible. It's the author. What did they do with it? And how did you as a reader interpret it? How did it work for you as a reader?
How did I feel that day?
Right.
Or that.
Yes. Has it been a minute since I read something like this, or have I just read 5 books back to back and I'm over it? You know, like, I don't know. Those are things, but all right. I think we're done. Unless you guys have more to add. I told my husband, I was like, I'm gonna try and keep it to an hour. This has never happened before, but I'm gonna try.
I know my husband was like, so when are you going to be done? I was like, between 1 and 1:30.
Nobody really knows.
With lives, you don't know. Like, you don't know how long it could go. You know, you could get into a really awesome, conversation stream, and you just don't want to stop.
Right. And there are times when I'm watching a live, and it's like we're 4 hours in, and I'm still here. I'm still watching. But yeah. So I really appreciate you all being willing to talk to me about it. One, in a live setting where things can go wrong, and two, just it's a controversial topic, and again, it's one that people can either have their experiences or just be very in their emotions about and be very upset about it easily in a way that maybe they would take the words wrong more quickly in this situation than they might in something that is not so upsetting or so close to their experience. So I appreciate you all being willing to talk about it. I think that we went into some interesting points and sidebars and stuff that I thought added to it. So I'm glad you all did it.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
For having us.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. And that's it. Bye.
Bye.